Okay, so maybe Margareta, if you could kick this off, what are your key points?
My 3 key points. Well, I think just to continue after what Lo said, when we have engaged and convinced all the stakeholders that this is an important topic, where do we want to get? Well, I think what it's all about is to have some kind of general agreement in the society on how to manage the resources and who's going to take these decisions. And I think the role of a public agency like SIDA is to support that getting to these agreements is a fair process. So one of our mandates is to strengthen capacities for a fair process. And when it comes to, I want to be very concrete and not talk so much about policy and these things, but when it comes to clarifying and defending communities' tenure rights, we have the opportunity to strengthen the capacity of communities to claim these rights. And I think it's important to remember that this process to get to these agreements, to get some kind of governance agreement, must be owned by the communities and the governments in the countries. We are not to dictate what's going to happen. But we can strengthen the capacity of the less powerful people. We have the mandate to favor poor and discriminated people. So we can support capacities in communities to organize, to participate in these consultative processes. Multi-stakeholder platforms is always launched as very important, essential to get to agreements, but who is going to represent communities?
And you can pay them to come and participate meaningfully in these.
And that's one option, that's an example. Training, access to information, we can train paralegals. There are many ways to strengthen the power of communities and their organizations, the civil society. But, no, 2 minutes. It's equally important to strengthen capacity of governments to motivate them, but also to strengthen their capacity to do these processes in a fair way, and to strengthen the capacity to coordinate between ministries, to coordinate within these multiple government actors or between them.
Do they want to be coordinated?
Well, part of it is to motivate. I mean, we're not going to dictate, but when there is a wish, we can strengthen that. And we can support national research capacity and education that's not that technical that it was before, etc., etc. Legal process, etc., etc. But that's just half of it. If we have established and clarified rights, how that's not equal to secure tenure. In order to have secure tenure, you have to be able to use and produce. And it has been mentioned in the morning that, I mean, we were talking about investment. What kind of investment is interesting? We can support investment in the production from the communities. It's essential that there are economic rights, that you can sell the resource that you have right to. We can support producer organizations, economy of scale from the communities, business capacity, access to markets, capacity to engage with the supply chains. There are so many ways to do things.
And out of all
practice.
These many...
And now. What happens within the communities? They are like the private sector. They are not one entity. If the community has rights, who are the members of this community? Are the women members of these communities? Are they represented in the consultations? Are they represented in the business? What about landless groups within the communities, etc., etc.? So, and this has to be thought about from the beginning and not in the end. And it should be much more included in our discussions today, actually. Because, yeah, what's a community? I think that's my last
Okay. Maybe.
point.
Thank you, Margareta. Yes, for the moment. Maybe Vicky, you want to go second?
Sure. Well, I'll have two hats here. I'll speak as the director of Tubtuba and also convening the Partnership for Indigenous Peoples, Forests, and Climate Change. And then the last part, maybe I'll say something about my role as the UN Special Rapporteur. So in terms of what we are doing with the communities, there are actually like 3 points. They told us we should say 3 points. First point, we really are focusing a lot on community strengthening, no? Because we believe that we have been activists like for 30 years now. We have fought the governments. We have done a lot of things. But in the end, we came up with a conclusion that the biggest legacy maybe that we can leave behind is strengthening capacities of our indigenous communities to be able to assert and claim their rights, to be able to monitor the changes happening in their communities, and to be able to use their own traditional knowledge systems that have been proven to be the ones that have saved many of the ecosystems where they live. And finally, to be able to connect also the work that they are doing, their community dreams and aspirations with the national and in the global decisions that are taking place. So that's one. Of course, we have developed a framework which we call the Indigenous People Self-Determined Sustainable Development, which integrates the human rights-based approach, because that's where we really have been fighting for a long time, and the ecosystem or landscape approach in terms of managing their territories, and also the intercultural approach, which means that it should be knowledge-based, it should have respect for the cultures, as well as an economic sufficiency approach, where they are not just remaining in situations of poverty, but they are able to strengthen their own traditional livelihoods and other technologies or investments that they deem useful for their communities. So we work in 14 countries all over in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and we are all coming together to try to influence also the global processes, which is my next point. We just don't maintain them in the community. We bring them in the arenas where they can share their own aspirations and claim their rights, and then we bring them to the negotiations on climate change and human rights arenas. We train them to use existing treaty bodies or the UN Special Rapporteur mechanism, and then we bring them to the bank, to the World Bank, to say something about the safeguard mechanisms. And in the process, they develop their capacities for leadership. In the process of doing this, we ensure that there are equal number of women and men, young and old, no, and of course different, even not just across communities, it's also across communities. And finally, we do the research, no, that's needed, and we link with other organizations, academics, so that they will develop the evidence that will strengthen the capacity of these communities to strongly advocate for what they are fighting for. So my last point is in relation to my role as the Special Rapporteur. As I was mentioned, I was just appointed recently. My mandate is to really monitor how states are implementing the human rights, economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights of indigenous people. So I have to do country visits, official country visits, and talk to the governments, create spaces of dialogue between indigenous peoples, corporations, governments, to talk about what needs to be done to address the situation in a particular country, and also to develop thematic researches and studies that will highlight indigenous people's desires. And so we are very much involved. I'm very much involved now with the post-2015 development agenda, for instance, because we would like to ensure that indigenous people's concerns are also integrated in those things. And of course, I make reports before the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, which will amplify further what the situation is of indigenous peoples.
Of course, your position is very much then looking if governments are following their international and national
Yeah.
procedures. But do you agree with what's been said before about this that when there is what is the stumbling block for indigenous peoples? Is it lack of government governance? Is it bad corporations or bad local elites, or what's?
Well, the biggest stumbling block, really, from my perspective, is they don't really comply with their international obligations under international human because it's not to their interest. I mean, their development framework is just to produce economic growth, and they don't really. I mean, at least I can say I haven't seen any government that really says that we care about the people. We will, we will respect your rights. That's not how governments think. Politicians are very short-sighted. They just want to get the votes, and after that, they can do anything they like. And I think that's the governance problem that we need to address.
Okay.
And the way to address that is strengthening other governance mechanisms, not just the government. Governance is not equivalent to government.
Okay. Thank you.
I have always been a revolutionary
Yes, you have.
in my own way.
What about you, Don? How many revolutions have you started? You have the chance to start one now.
Just contributing to coup d'etats. So I'm taking a perspective. I'm an investment banker. So I'm going to give you a little different perspective. Three messages. One is that you cannot view land tenure in isolation. And that when you see that communities need money, I think that's just a simple statement of fact. They need capital. It's not just financial, it's also social capital, et cetera. But they need capital. But the problem is that in the emerging markets, there's lots of risks for investors. And so how do you mitigate that? So the places that want the capital, there's a series of reasons why they're not getting it. And it's not just tenure, though that can be a contributing one in the case of forestry. It's the first observation. The second observation is that we've heard about this concern about, Arvin already mentioned, one of the two key trends is increasing demand on the resource. I would argue we've underestimated what's going to happen. It's not just about economic growth, it's not just about population. There's a structural change that has occurred in financial capital markets, which is leading to an excess of capital. We can over dinner and a glass of wine talk about it, the why and the empirical evidence, but there's good estimates that in terms of financial capital, between now and the end of the decade, it's going to increase by about 50%, from about $600 to $900 trillion.
And explain to me what will happen.
Three implications. The first one is that interest rates are going to be lower than a lot of people expect. One of the things that means, land is more valuable. Long-lived assets. Second, with interest rates lower, people are going to be willing to take more risks. We're chasing yield. All of our pension funds are. We're chasing yield. That means that they're going to find the risk associated with the emerging markets actually more palatable. They're going to chase it. The third thing is that what's becoming valuable? Less and less, it's power shifting from those who have money to invest to those who have something worth investing in. Let's think that through. I would argue that's two things. One is actual technical knowledge. The second is natural resources which have poor substitutes. Now, that's really important, poor substitutes. I would argue that one of those is good quality land. Note that I didn't say forest land. I said land. This already immediately makes us look beyond just forest tenure. So those are three of the implications there. The good news is that there's going to be more capital and we need it. The bad news, not all capital is created equal. I'm going to assert that there's good capital and there's bad capital. I'm also going to assert that the good capital is more risk averse. They care about reputations. Bad capital wants to get money pretty quick. And so you're going to see bad capital, which there's going to be more of it out there, coming to a forest near you. They're going to be the ones who come in first. So, the first observation is, it's not just about tenure. Second is, there's lots of capital as implications. Third is, how do we attract good capital?
And the main question is, what can we do given this?
Well, how can we attract good capital? Let's see how we do it. I'm private sector, so I'm kind of simple-minded. So I look at concrete examples. I would assert that what we need to do is look at specific examples of alternative business models. And specifically, get very specific in looking at public-private community partnerships. And give specific examples how we engage each of those in specific projects so that we can point to it and say, to these people who have good capital, we can point and say, it actually works in these emerging markets which we're all afraid of. And under the question and answer, we can talk about what do you need to do in the context of forestry. Because we can have some very specific ideas on what investors, good capital want, and then in fact it's stable yield. So how do we do that in the context of forestry? That's the challenge.
But you pointed to the private-public community partnerships.
The community's role will be supplying on a sustainable,
and do you have one
basis.
example?
Sure, let's put in the examples where the community is providing biomass to a processing facility. What they're good at, so the question is, for any investor is, do I have sustainable, low-cost biomass? Well, if I don't go there. So part of the role is that community to supply that. We get them on board, the community.
Yeah. Okay.
The second is, what do you do with that? How do you create value with it? Well, that's the private sector is a little better at. So you get someone who actually knows how to run a sawmill. But also look at it that only half of, and I'm being very specific here because we're talking about timber, only half of a log goes to lumber. What does the other half go? It's residues. Well, in the north, in Sweden and Canada, we make pulp and paper. We're not going to do that in the DRC. What are you going to do? The role is energy. That's really important because if you can then find someone who's going to buy your energy at a stable price. We know we need energy because that's one of the preconditions for economic development.
But how do we, we'll get back to that, but how much do we see that happening? Do we see on the
do
ground
examples.
this happening? Okay, there will be more. Let's talk to the good capital. The good capital which Christina represents. This is what it looks like.
Thank you. Well, let me just say a few words about the second Swedish National Pension Fund first, because we are one of the 4 large buffer funds here in Sweden. It's part of the national pension system, even though we are a state authority, but we mostly regard ourselves as more of a private entity, even though we are a state. So it's really mixed. We manage around 280 billion Swedish krona, so we're one of the largest pension funds in Northern Europe. We have a global portfolio. We have a lot in equities, actually stocks, roughly 50%. We have a bit more than 30% in bonds, and then the rest will be alternatives. And within the alternatives, we also started to invest in forestry and farmland, exactly for the reasons we had the financial crisis. We had to have looking into what asset classes could we invest in order to not be correlated to the financial markets. So it's, just as you said, a lot of investors are looking into real assets, and forest is one, and we think it's a good asset class for us because it's long-term, and we have a long-term obligation, and we want that stable returns. So, and we started in 2010, and then how to do this, where to invest. And we actually, one of the first issues was actually the land rights issues, where to invest. We are, in this case, risk averse. We don't want to go into the regions where you don't have good tenure rights. So we started to invest in the United States. So that was actually where we made our first forestry investment. And then we went to Australia and New Zealand. And that's actually because we see land rights as it is a complicated issue, and we are not we don't chase the high returns. We want the stable returns. So we are for forestry. We are in very stable markets or mature markets. And we also, I could say that we demand our managers to adhere to the sustainability standards, FSC or PFC. In 2011, we also started to invest in farmland. And then we also started in the United States. Went on to Australia and Brazil. Brazil being more of a developing country where land rights is an issue, but they have a good legal framework. It has not only been maybe enforced. So I was actually part of doing a sustainability due diligence before entering into this investment. And in Brazil, our manager do very thorough legal or title chain research. So they actually go back to where actually the land was given, or the government actually gave up the land to the private owner. And we only buy actually land from private owners. And they have to be really clear title in order for us to be secure to engage. And just coming back to some of the key issues, I have two issues. I think for us as investors, it's really important to do our due diligence, to know what we invest in, not only where we invest in the regions or the assets, but also what the managers we actually work with, to actually know their values, so we are aligned on that, and that we can have a good collaboration, and if something occurs, we can actually handle that.
So in concrete, your concrete views?
So actually to be, for investors to be more knowledgeable, to have more, in-house knowledge, not only to use consultants, which
Facilities
is
and consultants. Oh.
Yeah, not to use them, actually to have their own knowledge of it. And I write reports as well. They are maybe 25, 30 pages, but of course it's this one-page summary for the executive committee and the board, of course. But I think it's quite important, so we feel comfortable that we can have a discussion about these issues. And the second thing I think can actually change things is actually to have greater transparency about these investments. And we are trying to push that. I took part in, together with other institutional investors, we are working with increasing transparency within a bigger framework called Principles for Responsible Investors. We have also had a subgroup of investors that actually developed principles for responsible investments in farmland, because we didn't see that equivalent was actually as we have in forestry. So we're trying to just...
Yeah. If we pick up on these, because that's been raised, and also for the facility, and there are numerous of these, well, they maybe start at voluntary standards of all kinds for all kinds of value chains or commodities, etc. But they tend to depend on an enabling environment to work, right? So, and it tends to be important not just if the buyer, maybe the Coca-Colas or the Stora Enso, whoever might be at the buying end, but is there sufficient enabling environment for these systems to work?
What you need is someone to convene the parties.
Sorry?
You need someone to convene the parties. That public, that private, that community.
At community level?
At the community level. At the end of the day, people make investments in a location. It's dealing with the community. But it's integrating, it's pulling all those three groups together on the partnership.
And which is a weak spot
they're all weak. One of the weakest, I would argue, one is when investors look at this sector, they see all of this strange risks, and they say,
let's go to the US.
puts down their pen, and they say, I don't want to deal with it.
But that's why US, New Zealand, and Australia is where you only invest. What's the point?
That's exactly. So what we need to do is, how do you mitigate those risks? And say, so who are the organizations that can pull together those parties and do what I would call the brain damage to work it out? Because it's not just dealing with the communities. One of the key problems with investors is, who am I going to sell when I put in the investment, who am I going to sell the product to? So it's going to be maybe this, in Tanzania, the city of Dar es Salaam is going to buy my electricity from my sawmill. That's not bankable. I can't trust them as an investor. So what role then, someone coming in, maybe it's a Swedish development company or the African Development Bank or whoever, comes in and backs it up. Someone's got to do that coordination role, that social capital. And I would argue, and I'm totally biased because I'm on RI's board, it's one of the core competencies of RI. That's
You're
what they
not
do.
yet on the board, but
Yeah.
so you're free to speak and maybe have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that in particular, I speak from experience. This is not an issue we knew anything about 5 years ago. They were extremely good in articulating it to us. Why this matters ahead of any number of other things that we could have paid attention to. I mean, you know, we do development problems, but there's a whole lot of problems and not a whole lot of us. So we have to decide where to allocate staff time. They made a good pitch. The problem matters. The facts are, you know, are evident, and there's an issue that has to be dealt with. And they're extremely good at putting us in situations where we're talking to other folks from our world that, you know, are just from different backgrounds, like a Rio Tinto or somebody like that. I would say that just to clear up on Margaret and Don's point about the demonstration of this public, you know, private community sort of concept, we haven't seen a whole hell of a lot of examples that works, and the reason is because it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. The public has to take that risk at the beginning to demonstrate that that's viable. There is no possibility, none, zero, that somebody from, you know, a PE firm or, you know, some wealth fund or, you know, just even an angel investor is going to put money into something that speculative. At the same time, I think you can't ask the public to put their money into something like that blindly. So it has to be constructed intelligently. It seems to me a little bit more thinking around that would be warranted, because I do see the same opportunities that Don sees. Having visited Cameroon, having visited Mexico, living part of the year in the Philippines, you see examples of, man, if you could just get this together, it would work economically, it would work socially. There just needs to be the capital to kind of prove that that's the case.
Okay, do we get a different opinion from someone on the stage that this is really a stumbling block somehow, that connecting these, that you need to work more jointly, and you need some broker function or meeting place, etc. Do we have any difference in views here, or do I need to go to the floor to? You think the floor would be good?
I think because I don't need to
okay.
intervene in this. They are already saying what the demand for the facility is. So,
Arne, did you have a different? Yeah.
I think we are talking about two scales. Now we're talking about a specific business case to have an agreement between the community and business and the public.
Yes.
You also have to look at the whole country and the system within the country, and then you can't negotiate with individual private capital maybe, but you have to make another process for it.
And why is that not happening today? I mean,
it
it would
happening.
make sense to have more investments in the countries. Obviously, there is investment, there is capital. So why isn't a stronger counterpart that somehow solves this problems? What's prohibiting it?
You have no examples that have worked well.
Yeah.
You need to provide examples. This is we're not going to do it at the country level or global level overnight. This is an incremental, iterative process. It's going to take time. Heaven forbid we're actually going to have to be patient about this.
Okay.
And also, the other thing I would say is that just to be clear, you're not talking about doing just one thing in one place. This is a phenomenon, this public-private community kind of concept. You see this in all sorts of different places. Figure out some intelligent way to network that and try it out in a few different places, relatively low level of capital, just to see if it starts working. Then you can get some demonstration at scale. Do it smart.
Arne, what would you throw to this panel with this?
Well, my starting point here is basically that poverty reduction is my main feature or my main interest. But we're also interested in the environment, the climate, and the CO2 problem. So we want forests which grow. So we want forests that can generate incomes to poor people in the area, and that can absorb CO2. So if you take Sweden for an example, we never had any community organizations in the forest, sort of privately or government owned or whatever, but we have built our wealth on the exploitation of forests at the same time as we have more forest now than we ever had. I mean, the volume is there. So you need some system that can, at the same time, preserve the forest and generate income. And that's where all of these organizations come in. And my questions to you you're talking about how to organize this in community forests. So my question is whether community forest is a good way of organizing the exploitation, an efficient device. Sort of collective agriculture was never a good idea. Is collective forestry a good idea? Or is there other ways of organizing this, like privatizing it or whatever? So where do you want to go?
Well, that's exactly right. And what you'll find, I'll just tie it into what the investor wants. The investor's preference is to actually own the land. Now, if you want to riot, just say you're going to privatize all the land. So that's often in these emerging markets not an option. But perhaps what we can do is part of it could be long-term tenure, corporately run. And then another large part could be essentially outgrower programs with the community. So you have both. Because we also have, if we're doing it, we have to be efficient about it in order to get our costs down. So there's different ways that we can try it, and that's one of the things that would be interesting to experiment with. Could it all be a community-based?
Vicky, any comments from more human rights activist background to these expectations being raised here?
Well, as far as I can see, I haven't really seen, maybe I don't know, but there has now been, I haven't seen a lot of good practice, in reality, in terms of the investors coming in, the government agreeing and supporting the community to be able to engage in a direct negotiations with that company and setting the conditions upon which that kind of investment happens. I haven't seen a lot of that, and I think that's what we want to see more. Is there really anything like that wherein the government and the rich people in the country are really going to allow these kinds of communities to engage with that kind of relationship,
Margareta, you said that you see that wants to support
the developing world. I'm not
Yeah.
speaking of Sweden or.
No, that's fair. Margareta, you said that SIDA can support if government is interested. We through research, etc., enlightenment show the importance but how you said something like social momentum for social change. It must be socially acceptable at the country governance level. And is that the stumbling block to get to that point, or where is it?
I see that Lennart is waving very energetically here.
Wow.
But what I would like to say just, we have to make the case that locally controlled forestry is viable. And I say locally controlled forestry because the thing is not community forestry or collective forestry or family forestry, it's finding local solutions. And as Lennart has been waving so much, I would like
Do you think I should kind of...
Yeah, I would like to invite you.
Thank you very much, Margareta. I work with family forestry within the Federation of Swedish Farmers as well as the International Family Forestry Alliance. And there's a great potential in enabling people to re-establish a forest cover as well as gaining money locally. This requires land tenure, that has been clear today. But that requires as well well-organized farmers and tree producers locally. Local associations, they may develop into economic associations, cooperative if you wish. And Sweden is a perfect example of this. And these initiatives cannot be driven by governments or investors. They have to be driven by the farmers themselves. But of course, both investors as well as governments have to recognize these organizations and have to see the potential of them, to have someone to speak to make better policy decisions, to have someone there to implement the policies that governments are deciding.
So your concrete suggestion would be?
No, it is to really see that you have to see that people working together, and again, back to Elinor Oström's, when people are organizing themselves locally, that power to make, because the whole driver in this is that the trees constitute a value for the farmer. And through being well organized, you maintain the value at the producer, which is the key driver. And when we see, I saw about the trends, in the last World Forest Status produced by FAO, presented in June. 26 countries have, during the last 5 years, implemented a farm forestry legislation, just as they did in Kenya. And we heard example, China and India is on the move. This kind of initiatives of using the farm forestry, not forest separated to agriculture, but the farm forestry, farmers planting trees, gaining money, that will succeed if they are well organized so the value remains with the producer. Thank you.
Okay, Gun. Sorry, you've been waving along. Yeah, you come even longer than Gunnar, so you'll go first.
I'm speaking from 20 years of experience as a defender of Indigenous and local people's rights, negotiating some of the positions of local communities when they decide to engage other sectors outside, so the colleagues with Vicky and the others. So I feel at the moment when we say, for example, just from where I come from, there's 75 active, engaged models out there, or potentially going to be models where communities are actually really mapping their territories. They can show that they have protected these forests, and there will be external forces, investors and others that are interested to come in and to sit down and look at possibilities. It's very risk averse from your perspective, from the private sector. Those are the risk takers are the foundations. Are some of them multilateral and bilateral programs that are investing in some of these initiatives. And they have all of these experiments running. And I really feel that there should be some kind of matching from the real private sector. Those that, I think, Lou, I like the way you said it about it's dysfunctional the way the grants are being given now, and that there has to be faith in the operator. And that's not easy. We're tied to log frames.
Okay, so one of the solutions would be more trust in the operators to make these more innovative.
And make it work and really apply the private sector.
We trust but verify. I mean, this is a classic thing in investing. We do this all the time. You know, you look at the guy across the table, well, maybe he's trying to screw me, I don't know, but it seems like a pretty good deal, and I've got other things that might mitigate the risk, and I can structure the investment so that I can see a little bit what's going to happen here, you know, and pull a little bit off the table. You do this in venture capital all the time. You commit a small amount early on, see if you can do something with that. Then if you do hit those milestones, why then that releases more money and it shows your ability to do stuff. It seems to me that by continually treating a lot of these you know, communities or local organizations or what have you as kind of welfare cases instead of as somebody sitting across the table in an actual negotiation that you want something from, you end up missing these opportunities.
Okay. With that, I would like to put all of you to work again. And I don't know, Cecilia and other Karin or Maria and others will hand out things for you. Because we will be asking you the same questions. And I suggest you sit in groups of 3. You move together, and the guy in the middle will be the one with carrying the pen and paper. And for those, that goes for you too. So you keep the pen and the paper here, and you do it there. I'll show you a slide to show I hope this will be up and running. You've been hearing up here. You've been hearing from the mainly from the speakers and the panelists what their best bets have been. You're not allowed to speak while I'm speaking. Rule 1, which, according to you, this is something we want all of you to respond to, and these will be collected. We'll be able to share some of them with you and respond to those suggestions by the panel here. But the question we want all to answer, which would be the 2 to 3 most concrete actions or strategic initiatives to secure better forest and community land rights? And as some might say, well, my best bet is totally outside of the forest sector. I think that's what counts the most. Feel free to say that, but it should have an influence on forest and community land rights. And then if you run into, you're getting bored with the first question, it was an easy one, or you couldn't agree at all, and you put some options that made everybody satisfied, you can move on to any of the questions below, which could be what can donors do, what can the private sector best do, and by the way, are we missing something? Maybe there are research gaps that suggest that we shouldn't really be running in this direction because we don't know the numbers yet. So I would like to kick you off with this overall question. And you have about 15 minutes to go before I'll interrupt you again. Okay. I think my microphone is increasingly loud. And that means that we're going to listen in. We here up front, as you can tell, they have been working hard. None of them have stretched their legs. Now Lou just did, but otherwise they're just sitting, discussing, and so have the rest of you. So now the process will be that I'm going to listen in from some of the groups, and then when you heard a number of them, we might invite these guys again to comment on issues being raised. But now start first from the floor. What sort of answers did you put on your paper? Maybe you could start with some researchers there. Sven, for instance. Okay, we need a microphone. And this is a hello to you people out there. Somehow, we know that people are actually following this. And for them, they need the microphone to hear you.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about land audit. So there's land audits going on all over the world. But it's an extremely important process to speed up. And of course, to be GPS-based. And in some cases, it costs a bit. So even if there is a land audit, it costs somehow to get a real paper. So that's something for donors to simply pay for this.
Sorry, I just heard the land audit part.
So the donors could simply pay a lot so that the farmer don't have to pay. Today, in many cases, you have to pay to really get that last piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
So to make the land audits happen, to make them 100%
affordable
and affordable. So that's really step one. And then you can start fighting when you have the papers to fight about.
Okay. We're not to comment yet. We are to bring your things that you discussed in your group. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Basically, in the first question, we have answered two things. One is about strengthening the local organization of family, community, and indigenous people to claim their land rights. So this means strengthening the local organization, civil society movements, so that they can able to claim their rights with the respective government and also private sector. Second, of course, we support the idea of Don Roberts that he brought, that enhancing the respectful partnership. We use the term here, respectful partnership. That means public-private community partnership, which can recognize the human rights, land rights, and freedom for association of the local communities. So basically, these 2 points we have raised in the first part, and then we have gone.
Well, let's stop with the.
Okay.
Sorry, did you want to follow on with question 2 and 3 or so? Was it?
Yeah, we did.
Okay,
yeah.
but we'll stay with this first. The major issues. You said we need to strengthen. Well, I put CSO, civil society organization, but it's really the communities to claim their rights and be good, have a power to negotiate and understand what's at stake, as a short. Enhancing respectful partnerships, that this private, public, and maybe NGOs, this coalition of to make responsible, to enhance this, to get economic activities that are respectful to all implicated. Yes, maybe we should ask someone over here. We haven't seen you, Martin, before. Yeah. Heard from you. I've seen you all along. Do we need assistance from there? Yeah, the mic is...
The mic... No, it's on. Okay, so 2 issues we brought up. One was the issue of the role of government was very much absent for the discussion you had. It was a really interesting discussion, but it would be interesting to hear about what you think about the role of government here. And one role we saw was regulating bad capital. You talked a lot about what good capital can do in sort of enabling this process and moving things forward, but you still have the bad capital, and one role the government could have was actually to regulate that bad capital and actually leveling the playing field for capital. The other issue was thinking about
how do you do that? How do you could you, or can you even be even more concrete?
I mean, it's regulations of how of land deals and what government or what companies do when they go in and
okay, stronger monitoring of these
exactly things like that. But yeah, okay. The other issue is thinking about how sort of local inequalities are affected by in these processes. So what do we mean by community here? Who is the community that sits down with the capital and to discuss who's at the table and who is not at the table? That might be negatively affected. So the risk, again, of local elites capturing the resources here and so on.
Okay. Ensure that local elite capture is not permitted somehow in these deals, concessions, etc., and mechanisms for making them, putting them in place that somehow have some balancing factor to. Is that roughly? Yeah. Okay. Sure. While I'll write this down. Someone else from, yes, you first, Gunilla.
Yeah, I will maybe continue a bit what we say when Magnus or Martin, that I think it's really important to identify the social stratification and differentiation in the community, not only talking about local community. And the next step, really respect what this local community and the different groups or socioeconomic groups are saying. I mean, if they say no, we are not interested in this investment, okay. Maybe they have other alternatives, but we should respect. Who are we? I'm not talking about donors or anyone. I'm thinking more about, as we said in our group, the national institutions, governments, so that there is a sort of legal framework in place and also resources so that they can fulfill these legal framework. Or what did we say? We said capable to follow and implement in a way that they can really get this opportunity to listen. Yeah. So it's not out in the air.
So it's not just participatory approaches and consultations, but taking no for an answer was your first point. The last one I lost. Can you?
No, that was maybe the next question, because it was about make sure that the legal framework is in place. But not only that, but also that the government has resources to implement and to follow and to make sure that that legal framework or law is respected.
So in concrete action, there somehow be a reprioritization of where budget is allocated in, with either you increase government budgets from somewhere or else you spend more of the budget on these. I think you're somewhere in this neighborhood of monitoring, improving monitoring of bad capital, or ensuring rule of law is followed in broader terms as well. Okay. This group sitting, you were 4 of you. We are looking forward to hear what 4 brains can put together. Marie. Okay, 4 different pieces of paper. Anyway, who wants to start? Okay. Do you? Start from the first question, and we'll stay with the first question for a second.
Okay. This is about how to, you know the first question, huh?
Yeah.
I put develop mechanisms to inform communities in a culturally appropriate way of national laws and forest laws and options for communities to establish their rights under such laws, including codification of customary tenure. Secondly, strengthen communities' capacity to request land registration. And for the second question, work with government at policy level on developing an appropriate land policy. Second one, work with government to develop legal mechanisms for communal land registration.
I'm not.
Third question.
I'm getting all confused. No, please, let's stay with the first ones. And this inform and establish rights.
No, inform
yes.
local communities
yes.
on government laws.
Okay, on government laws, yes.
And on the option.
And the second was this about empowerment, right?
No. And under
I'm getting all wrong.
And under such law, inform the communities what options they have to request land registration.
Mm-hmm.
And then build the capacity of the communities to request the registration.
Yes, I put build capacity. I think it fits within the broader context. Now, if you had one more on that first one, on the first question, or else? No.
I mean,
or else, let's see if there are others who feel that their thinking has not already been covered, because there are some emerging things that come up again and again. Who has something that's not properly covered so far? In the very back, Anders.
Thank you. We had the Forest Agency and the University of Agricultural Science here getting together. We heard good things from Margareta, supporting the situation for communities to become business partners. And we have discussed this in the afternoon, and we think this is tremendously important. Public-private partnership can help, but they might need some time to organize themselves. Adding to this, looking for the good examples. Now, the solution for empowering these might be very different in different contexts. And analysis and synthesis of these and research on the good, looking for the good example, describing them, analysis and them can give more light to how to work with this.
So also a call for research to capture
multidisciplinary.
Yeah, multi. Any other buzzwords that are good for funding? Yeah. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Yes, please.
And we basically had 2 categories. One were extractive companies or companies engaged in mining, oil extraction, commodity, non-renewable commodity extraction, who were seeing the future when land was scarce and commodities were scarce, who would be forward-thinking and would take a longer view of establishing a better relationship with landowners and with communities.
Are you saying we should target these
So they could be targeted, one, to scale up. What they're doing is exciting. But then the second thing of saying there's alternative models emerging where communities are the owners and managers of their resource. And they're in different kind of private sector. They aren't really the big corporates, or they aren't the ones who control the model. They're more the ones that scale up and help invest, like Kickstarter type things, outgrower schemes, non-timber forest products, small-scale forest products in the domestic market. So there's a whole set of domestic investors as well, and maybe they eventually scale up to the pension funds or whatever, but they're who you target initially.
You would be targeting, again, how would you frame that in one?
Well, scale up alternative models through shared knowledge. And the second half of that, we said, was that communities needed to have a strengthened capacity and knowledge, both because they're the ones that reach out to those investors and establish relations, and two, they're the one that promote their rights because they can show governments that those economies exist.
Okay, thank you. Yes, a final, I think it will be the final, and Gunnar was before Samuel, so first come, first serve. Not longest come, longest.
So thank you. I'd just like to follow up there on Augusta's point. So these are concrete actions to secure better forest and community land rights, and we've been talking a lot about strengthening the community right. If we go back to Jenny's picture in the morning, we know that in many cases we're talking about the government giving up the rights to the communities, right? So we really have to look at the incentives for the government, and motivate the government to give up these rights. And we have to do this probably in different dimensions. We have to show that this leads to better development outcomes, better environmental outcomes. Maybe also dig deeper into the incentive structure.
Is it motivating government to continue devolving rights, or is it motivating them to uphold the rule of law, or to go after the bad capital, or is it a mix?
Well, basically, it is to give them very good argument and motivate them to transfer these rights, as many of these rights as possible, to the communities. And we have seen, as we saw in your statistics, there is still a lot to be done there. And we also, of course, have to be able to show that these outcomes are being met. Then.
Okay, maybe one of you, we will not hear everything. Maybe one of you put something on question number 2. Was there someone who did that? You're only allowed to question number 2. I'm very bad, but you'll be able to hand in your paper and we'll have people typing every word of it. Question number 2, yes.
One of the important things that we saw as to achieve some of the things in question 1 was to encourage the donors to tie their funding to governments to achievement of some of those targets that we mentioned in question 1. So sort of a trigger mechanism for achievements of the actions that is set out in 1, tied to funding.
Tied donor funding to government action
on achieving those targets.
On tenure rights, something like that. Okay, that's a drastic one. Here's another from Sida now. That maybe what.
Oh, sorry. Since I couldn't pose my question, I will suggest something that donors could do. An issue that we haven't brought up and discussed today is actually corruption. So I would like to. Maybe we could do something to create incentives to minimize corruption, because I think that's a driver.
Here's an incentive: you tie your donor fund. Sorry.
Thank you, Olof.
No. Okay. But it's anti-corruption in natural resources sector specifically.
Anti-corruption, but you have to find incentives for people to work on these issues. I mean, I think all these suggestions are very good. We've been discussing them for ages, but I think that what are the incentives for people to change their attitudes and change their behavior?
I heard Lou and this group say something about what could change the incentives, but we'll get to you in a second. Okay, the final one on question 2.
I'll allow my partners in this group to correct me if I miss anything here, but we discussed the importance of donors helping, and this ties to question 3, helping to mitigate risks for program-related investments so that risk-averse private sector donors can enter into the kinds of sort of innovative public-private community mechanisms we were discussing before. So providing that let's not say subsidy, but that capital that can reinforce an investment to get it over the hump, to get
Is
it to that point where it's
soft
viable.
loans and guarantees, and is to lower the risk, or is it?
It's starting to look at sort of those less less of a charitable model or grant administration model in their donations, and more thinking in terms of how to look at sort of financing these community enterprises in a way that doesn't create dependency, but rather enters into a relationship with them as partners in creating a sustainable livelihood.
There's been a lot of talk about what donors can do, so let's move to question 3. How did it read out? Private sector best engage. What is it that they could do best? That anyone who had the time to look at that? That's fair enough. I'm sure we've heard some of the things that they couldn't do. They could, by doing more proper due diligence, by really assessing risks properly, and by also, that's what I'm stealing from you now, from your discussion, just by saying to the Ministry of Investment or what they have that we don't want to come here. There's too much uncertainty. It's becoming a problem. We'll go to the country next door. Even sending those messages very strongly to key parts of government might create an incentive to address these issues. You can moderate that when it's your turn, which will be in a second. Okay, fine. And question 4, those speed people, main research gaps. Did we get a research gap? We have room for 2 research gaps, not more. Okay, Gunilla first. A succinct.
What I've been thinking of as I've been looking at community land rights in the northern part of Mozambique with big investments in large-scale activities, I'm trying to understand, find out, how could we find a way of complementing large-scale and small-scale activities in a sustainable way? Can we find meeting points? Can we find ways on how they can complement each other, support each other? So when the private sector is coming in, for example, in very large-scale activities, can that be done in a sustainable way? Looking at the environmental and social impact assessments done up in that region, there were a lot of recommendations on how these large-scale activities could be done, at least improve the sustainability. I don't know if to reach maximum of sustainability, but planting and mosaic patterns, corridors, a lot of good recommendations they had. And also in combination with activities, more small-scale, private activities with the local, yes. Investors and so on. How could we, I tried when I was at SLU at that time to ask for help from colleagues to find out how could we make sure that even large-scale activities can be done in a sustainable way. So I think more research is needed there because some activities has to be large-scale. They cannot all be small-scale.
But you've had your chances, Gunnar. Sten, we're running out of time. Sorry. Okay, did you want the microphone, Sten? Okay, a very quick one. We have not permitted this before, but for you, I make one exception.
I have the last couple of years worked with the issue, a controversial issue, soil production and deforestation. And I have changed my mind during this journey. I think there is a lot to gain from the big companies like Cargill, Unilever, because they have resources, they now have the ambition to be sustainable, and they can help the community forest or the communities in the production.
Okay, well.
So I think the NGOs has to stop to blame all of the big companies being bad boys.
Okay, good. Gunnar, yes, very quick.
So I have, hello?
So I have a very clear research gap in this area. It's very clear from the past literature on community management of forest that we don't know which management institution is best suited for various kinds of ecological and social situations. So we really, really need to have like a research program here looking at how should we best manage this forest in terms of the efficiency, economic output, but also the distribution of the resources.
Okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes to go before we start closing, and I would like to start off this panel to just in about to correspond to all these great things being said, and you may pick up on any one of them, but this is, you have one kind of 2-minute slot each, and that's it. So starting with Lou.
Okay, so 5 things really quickly. First of all, from the investor standpoint, I think that you'll be successful in being able to get a positive investment message from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, folks like that. We like these sorts of environments to invest in. I think it's less likely that they're going to say, we're not putting our money into such and such country. That can be a little bit more sensitive for them to do. I also don't think that they're going to engage in lots of different dialogues and meetings and all that sort of stuff. It's just difficult. They've got other things to do. Somebody talked about regulatory structures, and there was a question about what might be done. Very practical thing. There are accounting standards. Lots of these are assets sitting on the books of countries who are listed on stock exchanges in the United States, Japan, Europe. Accounting standards boards have a say in how their assets are valued. If there is uncertainty associated with an asset and its performance over time, it should get discounted. This may be something of an injector of uncertainty into those assets. It seems to me very important, the point that you made, the idea that you want to have a mechanism that goes through the process of telling communities, you know, here's your options under local law, and gives them the capacity to be able to ask for this stuff. I mean, you know, it seems to me that that's a very important ground level step that's not being accounted for. Fourth, I think that you can align incentives of governments with this process around foreign direct investment, and this is something that we talked about in our group. I think you would particularly sell the idea of good capital being available at longer maturities, because it aligns with pension fund obligations going out and that sort of stuff. And the idea that they would have a little bit more stability if they knew where the investment was coming from on a consistent basis, and it wasn't just going to come in, go out, and screw up their currency, things like that. Lastly, it seems to me that the best way to understand what the best management systems are on the ground is to try to invest in those management systems in a performance-based way. It could be that the answers are very different in forests, say, in Nepal than they are in forests in Cameroon. But both of those countries are linked by their need for capital. You can put capital into Nepal, you can put capital into a community or locally managed forest in Cameroon, but you can put that capital in a way that says, we're going to look for some results out of this, environmentally or socially or what have you.
Okay.
Condition the investment.
Thanks. Yeah, just follow. Ari.
Okay. I see 3 very specific things emerging from the entire discussion and what we presented as well. And also, it bursts need to clarify on a couple of them. One is, there has been a discussion about the community and indigenous people in a manner as if they are the weakest, the ones who are not organizing, the ones who are not doing anything. And there are actually right here in this particular hall 3 different examples. You look at Leonard, look at Ghanshyam, look at Vicky. They have organized communities either as family forest or as community forest or as indigenous people. There is tremendous amount of organizing going on, and that's what we need to recognize, where that is strengthening can now really be converted into political action. So that's one of the things which I think are extremely important that we must recognize. The second, which my colleague hinted earlier, I do think that the investable space for the good capital, good companies as well, to do business is shrinking. You cannot continue to do business only in US and Australia. Means where are you going to invest? Because until and unless the clarity of who owns what, whether that particular ownership is enforceable in a court of law or not, and whether the people who own that particular thing can access that particular justice or not, is very important. And since that space is shrinking, there is now awareness, both amongst the good capital people and good companies, that something ought to be done. That's a very good sign for us, and we should think about it. The last. After a very long time, at least the progressive donors are now starting to fund innovative, untested approaches. I think if we put these three things together, we will reach close to the solution. I don't have a ready-made solution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Christina?
Now, I would actually just want to stress that actually the investor community and also the, big corporations actually are concerned about these issues, and it's a lot of work going on that actually are aligned with the NGO community. We want really the same thing. We just have different agendas, and we have to have a bigger understanding of each other. So,
may I challenge that? When I was in Bangkok in a meeting when they said, well, all the financing that takes place here is no Swedish pension fund, no, it's just regional money, and they don't discuss these issues.
Yeah,
can that be true at the same time?
Yeah, it could. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard this.
Yeah.
Same issue with.
So it might not be all the investors, but you're still saying that from Europe, you're seeing a change.
With the, more the big, the pension funds and the major institutional investors are discussing these issues. So
okay, good.
Government of Singapore does say it. Temasek does say it. It gets back. You got good capital, you got bad capital.
Okay. Vicky?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, I still believe that devolution is really should be working. And it should not be the kind of devolution where when governments fail, they give the work to the communities or at the local level. No, it should be devolution that's really sincerely wanting to strengthen the communities and their capacities to really develop on their own pace and in a culturally appropriate way. So I think that's one key thing. The second one is, of course, this kind of local development or community development should also be very democratic in terms of ensuring participation of women, for instance. We believe, we discussed it at our group, that empowerment of women is a crucial element of that kind of development. Secondly, I really would like to see an enabling environment at the national and local, national, and global level. This means finally reconfiguring what development should be, to veer away from business as usual. I don't think the way we have done economic development in the past is going to work. That is a disaster, and we should really shift away from that process. And the partners, our partners in doing that, are the communities who are most passionate about maintaining and keeping their communities sustainable and their ecosystems functioning. And thirdly, I think we have to think about other investors. If the good investors or good capital are coming and are not coming, then there are all this China capital, excess money from all these emerging countries, which are just desirous of getting more profit.
You need the monitoring still.
Yeah, and then also really instilling the good framework, human rights framework, for instance.
Finally, we're having a divergent views here.
No, I'm sorry, just really quickly on the Chinese in particular. There is a deep misunderstanding of their interests. If anyone would be interested in this story, if properly presented, it would be them.
Well,
because they care about security of supply over a long term. They're making the investments not purely for financial reasons.
We hear that they are not too exactly
I just want
complementary.
to say a few things about that. One thing.
I think it's enough to say that there are divergent views on that.
Indigenous communities are not seeing that, at least from from many
Okay,
areas.
I agree. Okay. I agree. Okay, so there is agreement, but still.
I agree.
Don?
I'm going to pass. Margarita's got more insightful things to say, and I will wait till I get a glass of wine and talk.
Okay, perfect. Margareta?
Well, I would like to recommend that we don't get too much carried away of the urgency of the situation, but also go for these long-term perspective and take the risk to commit to long-term projects where we can correct all the mistakes on the way and be persistent. I was looking at Arvind's description on donors of today: unpredictable, scattered, unreliable, projectified.
Have you signed the papers?
Well, I just wish that more of us want to go in the opposite direction.
Okay, thank you very much. And I haven't fallen down yet, nor have this. We're reaching the end of the seminar. I would like to thank you all up here on stage and all of you participants for throwing in good ideas to this panel. I'm not closing it. I'll leave that to more important people. But with this, and I think this was a fair summary of the afternoon session that you heard up here. And maybe all of you have not gotten all the answers yet. You might not be totally in agreement with everything, but that's how it is. It's about long term, it's about empowerment, it's about different actors, it's about government taking its role, and it's finding the incentives for change that will make change happen. So I think we've touched upon a lot of important issues. So with that, thank you very much from you up here as panelists.